Gertrude Dugan had spent 31 years learning how to disappear, and she had become very good at it. She moved through the dusty streets of Harlan Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, carrying a basket of mended garments that belonged to other women with husbands who noticed them, women with names that carried weight in conversation, women who were greeted by name when they walked through the door of Caldwell's General Store. Gertrude was not one of those women. She was the one who returned the garments, collected her modest coins, and slipped back out into the street before anyone had fully registered her arrival. She had long ago stopped being surprised by it. She had simply accepted it the way one accepts a scar, not with joy, but with the quiet resignation of someone who has already spent all her grief. Harlan Creek was not a large town. It sat in the wide, rolling flatlands of southwest Texas, surrounded by scrub brush and red dirt, and the kind of sky that made a person feel both enormous and entirely insignificant at the same time. The town had one main street, a church with a bell that stuck in wet weather, a saloon called the Iron Spur that was more lively than holy, a blacksmith, a doctor who was also the barber, and a collection of homes and outbuildings that had sprung up over the past 2 decades like determined weeds. It was a town of approximately 400 souls, and Gertrude Dugan knew nearly all of them. The trouble was that nearly none of them knew her back. She lived alone in a 2-room house at the east end of town, a house her father had left to her when he died of consumption 3 years prior. Her mother had gone long before that fever, when Gertrude was only 11, and she had grown up in her father's quiet, bookish company, learning to sew and cook and manage a household while also learning that the world did not readily notice quiet women. Her father had been a kind man, but distracted, always absorbed in his ledgers and his penny newspapers, and Gertrude had learned early to be self-sufficient in ways that went far beyond the domestic. She had learned to be self-sufficient in her loneliness as well. Her work was mending and alterations, and occasionally the making of full garments for those who could afford it. She was extraordinarily skilled. Her stitches were nearly invisible, her eye for fit was uncanny, and she could alter a dress to flatter a figure in ways that made women wonder why they had ever worn it any other way. But good work did not make a person seen. It made the work seen. And so Gertrude's reputation was that of a fine seamstress whose name people sometimes struggled to recall, and whose face they often confused with someone else entirely. She was not an unattractive woman. She had dark auburn hair that she wore in a practical knot, gray-green eyes that were quiet and observant, and a face that was pleasant without demanding attention. She was of medium height and carried herself with a stillness that some people mistook for coldness, and others simply failed to notice at all. She wore her plainest dresses to town, not out of vanity or its absence, but because her better dresses were reserved for church, and because she had long since stopped dressing for an audience that was not watching. On this particular October morning, she was returning a set of mended curtains to Agnes Whitmore, who lived in the large yellow house on the corner of Main and Birch, and who was the kind of woman who filled every room she entered with the force of her personality. Agnes was 45, married to the town's most successful cattle broker, and she hosted the kind of social gatherings that defined the social landscape of Harlan Creek. She greeted Gertrude at the door with the curtains already half forgotten in her attention. "Oh, the curtains, yes, wonderful," Agnes said, taking them with one hand while gesturing with the other toward the street. "Have you seen the new man in town? Monroe Ellsworth, they're saying. He's bought the old Callahan spread out on the northern road. They say he's come all the way from Wyoming Territory with 300 head of cattle and enough hired men to fill the Iron Spur twice over." Gertrude had not seen him, but she nodded politely because that was what one did with Agnes Whitmore. "They say he's not yet 40 and already one of the most successful cattle ranchers north of the Pecos," Agnes continued, clearly delighted by the information. "And he's unmarried, which means every mother in this town will be dragging her daughters to every gathering from now until Christmas. She laughed at her own observation and then seemed to recall something. "Oh, the coins for the mending, just a moment." She disappeared inside. Gertrude stood on the porch, looking at the street, and that was when she first saw Monroe Ellsworth. He was riding down Main Street on a gray roan horse, a large, well-muscled animal that moved with the kind of easy authority that horses have when they know they are well-ridden. The man on its back was tall even in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that was touched at the temples with the beginning of gray, and a face that was weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors. He was somewhere in his late 30s, and he had about him the look of a man who was entirely comfortable in his own skin, which was a quality that Gertrude had always found quietly remarkable because she had never experienced it herself. He wore a plain dark coat over a work shirt, and his hat was pulled low against the October sun, and he was talking to the man riding beside him, a lean, sandy-haired cowhand, with the relaxed focus of someone who was used to directing without having to raise his voice. He did not look at Gertrude. She had not expected him to. She turned back to the door just as Agnes returned with her coins, took them with a quiet thank you, and walked back down the porch steps. That, she assumed, was the end of it. She was wrong. 3 days later, Gertrude was at Caldwell's general store, selecting thread from the small but serviceable selection that Mr. Caldwell kept in a wooden box near the front window. The store was busy for a Tuesday. Several ranchers' wives were examining bolts of new calico that had come in on the weekly wagon from Abilene, and the Caldwell boy was stacking tins of peaches in a precarious tower near the back. Gertrude was focused on matching a thread color to the scrap of green wool she had brought in her pocket, and she was so absorbed in this task that she did not notice the door open behind her or hear the footsteps approach until a voice came from just over her shoulder. "Excuse me, ma'am. Do you know if they stock any heavy-gauge canvas thread? I've got saddlebags that need stitching and I haven't found a decent notions shop in 40 miles. She turned. It was Monroe Ellsworth, standing approximately 3 feet away, hat in hand, looking at her with direct, unhurried attention. She blinked. People did not usually speak to her in stores unless they needed to reach past her for something. "The canvas thread would be in the second box," she said, recovering quickly and indicating the row of drawers behind her. "Mr. Caldwell keeps the heavier threads in the third drawer from the left. The wax thread for leather and canvas is in the fourth." He looked at the drawers, then back at her, and there was something in his expression that she could not immediately categorize. He was looking at her the way a person looked at something they found genuinely interesting, not with the polite, glazed attention of someone performing courtesy, actually looking. "You sound like a woman who knows her thread," he said. "I'm a seamstress," she said. "It's my business to know." "Well, that's fortunate timing," he said. "Monroe Ellsworth." He extended his hand. She shook it, noting the roughness of his palm, the steadiness of his grip. "Gertrude Dugan." "Miss Dugan," he said, not Mrs., which meant someone had told him, or he had noticed the absence of a ring, or he was simply being careful. "I wonder if I might ask your professional opinion on something. I've got a crew of 7 men and they came through the trail drive in rough shape as far as their gear goes. There's mending that needs doing that goes beyond what any of them can manage with a needle. Is that the kind of work you take on?" Gertrude considered. She did primarily women's garments and household linens, but she had done men's work shirts and trousers before, and the money was money. "That depends on how rough a shape we're talking about," she said. "I can mend most things, but if the fabric itself is too far gone, no amount of stitching will save it." "Fair enough," he said. "Would you be willing to come out to the ranch and take a look? I can pay for your time either way." She studied him for a moment. He looked back at her steadily, without impatience or performance. There was something disarming about it. "I could come by on Thursday," she said. "Afternoon." "Thursday afternoon it is," he said. And then he smiled, a real smile, not a social one, the kind that reached the creases around his eyes. "I'll find that canvas thread now. Thank you for the direction." He moved past her toward the drawers, and Gertrude stood holding her green thread and felt, for the first time in a very long time, as though she had just been seen. She told herself it was business. She told herself that on the ride out to the Callahan spread, which was now, apparently, to be called the Ellsworth Ranch on Thursday, with her mending kit in a cloth bag beside her on the bench of the borrowed wagon she had arranged through Mr. Caldwell's boy. The northern road was well worn, and the October sky above it was the blue of deep water, and the scrub brush along the roadside had taken on the pale gold of autumn. It was a beautiful day, and Gertrude breathed it in carefully, as though she was trying to store the sensation of it. The ranch was further along the road than she had remembered from the time she had passed the old Callahan place years ago, and it had changed considerably. The Callahans had been decent ranchers but indifferent about upkeep, and their buildings had shown it. Whatever Monroe Ellsworth had been doing in the 3 weeks since his arrival in Harlan Creek had been vigorous and purposeful. The fence posts were new, the main barn had been re-sided on one face, and there was the sound of hammering coming from somewhere beyond the main house as she pulled the wagon into the yard. The main house itself was a solid 2-story structure built of good lumber, not the finest she had ever seen but genuinely cared for, with a wide porch running the length of the front. A man was sweeping the porch when she arrived, and he tipped his hat and called into the house, and a moment later Monroe Ellsworth came out through the front door with his coat off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow. "Miss Dugan," he said, coming down the porch steps. "You found it all right." "I know the road," she said, accepting his hand to step down from the wagon with a brief and businesslike touch. "You've been busy since you arrived." He looked around the yard with a critical, appraising eye. "There's a great deal still to do. The north pasture fencing needs replacing entirely and the water trough system needs extending before the winter cold sets in, but we'll get there." He turned to her. "Come inside first. The men's gear is in the bunkhouse, but I've had it brought up to the main house so you can look it over without having to navigate 7 cowboys in a small space." She almost smiled at that. "That's considerate." "My mother raised me to be considerate," he said simply. The inside of the main house was clean and functional, with very little in the way of personal decoration, beyond a framed map of Wyoming territory on the wall of the front room, and a leather-bound Bible on the shelf beside the fireplace. There was a worktable near the window where a pile of garments had been arranged: shirts, trousers, one canvas duster that had seen very rough use, and several pairs of leather-work gloves that had been included perhaps hopefully. She began going through them methodically, while Monroe sat in the chair across the table and watched her work without apparent self-consciousness about the watching. "Some of this is salvageable," she said, turning a shirt over in her hands. "This one has good fabric, but the seams have given way in 3 places. Straightforward work. This," she held up the duster, "is a different question. The tier along the back is 8 inches and the canvas has weakened around it. I can close it, but it won't hold the same way it would have new. Will it keep the rain out? If I reinforce the patch properly, yes." "That's all I need to know," he said. She continued through the pile, making notes in the small notebook she always carried for measurements and job details. Monroe did not fill the silence with unnecessary talking, which she noticed because most people did. He watched her work and occasionally asked a practical question, and when she looked up at one point, he was not looking at the clothing at all but at her face, and he did not look away when she caught him doing it. "What brought you to Harlan Creek?" she asked, because she was uncharacteristically curious, and because the silence had grown comfortable enough that a question felt natural rather than intrusive. "Opportunity," he said. "The Callahan land was priced fairly, and the grassland here is better than what I had in Wyoming for winter grazing. I've been ranching up north since I was 22, and I've been looking for a place to put down permanent roots for a few years now." He paused. "Wyoming is beautiful, but it's unforgiving, the winters especially. You don't have family in Wyoming, people who will miss you." "My parents have been gone a long time," he said. "I have a brother in Kansas City who I see once or twice a year. My roots were never very deep in Wyoming in the personal sense. I was there for the land and the cattle, And when better land and better cattle presented themselves here, the decision was easier than it might have been for a man with more attachments. There was something in the way he said the last part that was not exactly loneliness but was adjacent to it, the way one tone on a piano is adjacent to the next one. She recognized it because she lived there herself. "Is Harlan Creek treating you well so far?" she asked. "People have been friendly," he said. "A little eager in some cases." He said it without unkindness, just observation. "Mrs. Whitmore came out to introduce herself within 2 days of my arrival. She brought a pie." Gertrude did smile at that. Agnes Whitmore is the social engine of this town. Her pie is the opening move. He laughed, a genuine, warm sound. "I suspected as much." She mentioned a gathering she was planning for the end of the month. "She plans at least one gathering a month," Gertrude said. "It's one of the reliable rhythms of life in Harlan Creek, like the Wednesday freight wagon and the Sunday sermon." "Do you attend them?" he asked. "The gatherings?" She looked back down at the shirt in her hands. "Not usually," she said. He did not push it, which was another thing she noticed and filed away carefully. He did not push. She finished her assessment, quoted him a fair price for the work, $2.50 for all of it, which was honest given the scope, and he agreed without negotiating, which was not the usual experience. Most clients negotiated. He simply said that was fair and asked when she thought she could have it completed. 2 weeks, she said. "I have other work in progress." "Of course," he said. He helped her carry the garments out to the wagon, and when she had arranged them in the back and climbed up to the bench, he stood beside the wagon with one hand resting lightly on the side rail and looked up at her with that same direct, unaffected attention. "Thank you for coming out, Miss Dugan," he said. "I hope the drive wasn't too much trouble." "It wasn't," she said. And then, because something in the honesty of his manner seemed to call for the same in return, she added, "It's a beautiful road." "I enjoyed the drive." He smiled again. "I'll walk you to the main road so you don't miss the turn in the scrub." He did, walking beside the slowly moving wagon, pointing out the landmark, a distinctive double-trunked mesquite, that marked where the ranch road rejoined the main road, and talking easily about the land and what he planned to do with the north pasture, and she listened and asked a question here and there. And by the time she reached the main road, she had been talking with Monroe Ellsworth for nearly 2 hours total, and had not once felt invisible. She thought about that on the drive home, with the golden afternoon light spreading across the flatlands, and the distant sound of a mockingbird doing its repertoire somewhere in the brush. She thought about what it felt like to be spoken to directly, to have someone look at her face when she was talking rather than past her at something more interesting, to have someone laugh at an observation she made as though it was worth laughing at. She thought about how these things should probably not be remarkable, because they were the ordinary courtesies of human interaction, and yet for her they were remarkable, precisely because they had been so rare. She told herself again that it was business. She told herself that, on the walk home from delivering the finished garments 2 weeks later, she had decided to deliver them on foot since it was a fine day, and she had arranged a ride with the Caldwell boy only to have him need the wagon for a delivery. And rather than delay, she had simply walked the 1.5 miles to the ranch road, and then the further half-mile up to the house, which by the time she arrived had given her wind-reddened cheeks and slightly loosened hair. Monroe was in the yard when she arrived, working with one of his cowhands, the sandy-haired one she had seen the first day, who she had since learned was named Pete Dawson, on a section of fence that had been brought in for repair. He looked up when she came through the gate, and for just a moment his expression was something she did not quite know how to name, something that moved through his face quickly and settled into a smile. "You walked," he said, not as a criticism, just as an observation. "The wagon was needed elsewhere," she said. "I don't mind walking." He was already moving toward her. "Let me take that." He meant the wrapped bundle of garments she was carrying. She handed it over. "Come inside, I was about to stop for coffee. Pete, take 15 minutes. The sandy-haired cowhand nodded cheerfully and sat down on the fence he had been repairing, pulling out a tobacco pouch. Inside, Monroe put the coffee on the iron stove while Gertrude unwrapped the garments on the work table to show him the work. He came to look them over, and she walked him through each piece. The seams she had reinforced, the patch on the duster that she had done in a herringbone stitch for maximum strength, the shirts that had been taken apart and resewn at the shoulders, where the original stitching had been inadequate for heavy use. He picked up the duster and turned it over in his hands, examining the patch closely. "This is excellent work," he said, and the way he said it was the way a person said something they genuinely meant, not the way people said things to fill space or to be kind. "Thank you," she said simply. He poured the coffee strong, dark, served in plain enamel cups that she somehow found appealing in their lack of pretension. And they sat at the kitchen table, and he asked her how long she had been in Harlan Creek, and she told him, and he asked about her work and how she had come to the trade, and she found herself telling him about learning to sew at her mother's knee, and then continuing through necessity after her mother died, and about her father and his quiet, bookish ways, and about the house on the east end of town that was hers now, and that she had spent the past 3 years slowly making habitable in ways it had never quite been when her father was alive. He listened to all of this with the same quality of attention he brought to everything complete, unhurried, genuine. And then he told her about his own beginnings, about growing up in Ohio in a farming family, about coming west at 19 with $20 and a good horse, and a certainty that the frontier had something to offer him that the Ohio Valley did not, about working for other ranchers for years before he had saved enough to buy his first small herd, about the slow, incremental building of something from nearly nothing over the course of 20 years. "You're not what people expect when they hear the words cattle rancher," she said, and then was briefly mortified because she had not entirely meant to say it aloud, but he only tilted his head with mild interest. "What do they expect?" "Someone louder," she said. "Someone who takes up more space." He was quiet for a moment. "I've known a lot of men who take up a great deal of space," he said. "It's rarely been my observation that the space was proportional to anything worth respecting." He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "I'd rather be someone who pays attention." She felt something shift in her chest, very small and very significant at the same time, like a key turning in a lock that had been closed so long the mechanism had grown stiff. He paid her for the work, the agreed amount plus an extra $25 that he said was for the walk and the trouble, and when she protested, he simply said the work had been worth more than she had quoted, and they had both known it. She accepted the extra $25 because arguing felt wrong in the face of his straightforwardness, and because she recognized that he was paying what was fair, not offering charity, and the distinction mattered to her. He rode with her back to the main road on his gray roan, which he said was named Calhoun after nobody in particular, just a name the horse had seemed to suit. She walked beside him and the horse, and they talked about the autumn weather and what it generally predicted for the winter, and he asked her which way the creek ran when it flooded in spring, and she told him. And by the time they reached the main road she was sorry to see the end of it, and she recognized that fact with equal parts pleasure and alarm. "I'll likely have more work as the winter sets in," he said, settling back in the saddle. "My men are not gentle with their clothing." "I'll be available," she said. "Good." He looked at her, and again the directness of it was something she had to steady herself against. "Miss Dugan, I hope you'll consider coming to Mrs. Whitmore's gathering on Saturday. I find myself in need of at least one person there whose conversation I can trust." She was quiet for a moment. "I told you I don't usually attend those." "I know," he said. "I'm asking you to make an exception." She looked down the road toward town, then back at him. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded as though that was a satisfactory answer. "Then I'll hope." She walked home with a feeling in her chest that was warm and tentative and frightening, the way new things that matter always are. She went to the gathering. She spent more time than usual on her appearance, which felt both foolish and necessary. She wore her best dress, a dark green wool that she had made herself and knew fit her well, and she pinned her hair up more carefully than she usually bothered to, and she wore the small pearl earrings her mother had left her that lived most of their life in the tin box on her dresser. When she looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand, she thought she looked like herself, only more so, which was perhaps the best one could hope for. The Whitmore house was bright with lamplight and the sound of voices when she arrived, and Agnes greeted her at the door with genuine surprise and immediate, gracious pleasure that made Gertrude suspect Agnes had a better heart than she sometimes received credit for. There were perhaps 30 people present, ranchers and their wives, the doctor, the preacher and his wife, a handful of the more respectable tradespeople and their families, and Monroe Ellsworth, who was standing near the fireplace with a drink in his hand talking to Henry Whitmore about cattle prices in a way that suggested he would rather be having a different conversation. He saw her come in. Across the room and through the movement of people and the warm golden lamplight he saw her, and his expression changed in a way that she felt more than observed, a settling, a focusing, something that was unmistakably glad. He excused himself from Henry Whitmore with a courtesy that was visible even from across the room and made his way to her. "You came," he said. "You said you'd hope," she said. "It seemed unkind not to." He laughed, and she felt the warmth of it as though it were physical. "Can I get you something to drink? Agnes has made a very aggressive punch that I've been warned about, or there's coffee." "Coffee," she said. "Always." They spent the evening largely in each other's company, and Gertrude was aware of the glances they attracted, the small observations passing between women who had nothing better to do with their attention. She was also aware that she did not particularly care, which was itself remarkable. She was so accustomed to being invisible that being visible felt strange and a little exposed, like stepping out of a dark room into sunlight and having to wait for your eyes to adjust. But Monroe's company was the sunlight itself, steady and warm, and the adjustment came more quickly than she would have expected. They talked about books. He had brought a small collection with him from Wyoming, histories and a few novels, and she told him about the small shelf she kept in her front room that had grown gradually through years of careful purchases from the traveling booksellers who passed through Harlan Creek twice a year. He asked what she was reading currently, and she told him, a collection of essays by a naturalist named Muir about the California mountains, and he was genuinely interested, asking questions about what Muir wrote and what she made of it. There were other conversations too, practical ones, social ones, the kind that the setting required. But they kept returning to each other, drawn back by something that felt less like choice and more like gravity, and when the evening was ending and he walked her to the door and helped her into her coat, she was aware of his hands on her shoulders briefly through the wool, and of how long it had been since anyone had touched her with that kind of simple, matter-of-fact care. "May I walk you home?" he asked. "It's only 2 blocks, she said. "I know," he said. "May I walk you home?" She looked at him. He was looking back at her, calm and direct and entirely serious. "Yes," she said. The night was cold and clear, with more stars than clouds, and their breath came in small white clouds as they walked. He offered his arm and she took it, and they walked in a comfortable silence that was not awkward at all, which was in itself significant because Gertrude had spent most of her life in silences that felt like failures. This one felt like understanding. At her gate he stopped, and she stopped beside him, and they stood in the starlight with the quiet of the east end of town around them. "Thank you for the evening," she said. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I meant what I said. You are the only person I spoke to tonight whose conversation I fully trusted." She looked at him carefully. "What is it you think you see when you look at me, Mr. Ellsworth?" She had not meant to ask it so directly, but it came out with a rawness she could not quite suppress. He was quiet for a moment, not as though he was searching for the right social answer, but as though he was thinking carefully about something that deserved careful thought. "I see someone who has been paying very close attention to the world for a very long time," he said. "And I see someone who has not been paid the same attention in return, and who has made peace with that in a way that I find more admirable than she probably means it to be." He paused. And I see someone I would very much like to know better if she's willing. Gertrude felt something in the architecture of her carefully maintained self begin to shift, like a building settling after years of standing very still. It was not unpleasant. It was the opposite of unpleasant, but it was vast and a little terrifying because she had built that architecture for a reason. I think I am willing, she said. I think that frightens me somewhat. That seems honest, he said, and his voice was gentle. Frightening things are often worth being frightened by. She laughed, soft and surprised, and he smiled, and they stood there a moment longer in the cold starlit night before she said good night and went inside. She sat in her front room for a long time after that with the lamp burning low and her hands folded in her lap, and the feeling of something beginning moving through her like warmth spreading from a new fire. She was 31 years old, and she had been invisible for all of them, and something was changing, and she did not know what to do with the size of it except sit with it quietly and let it be. Over the next several weeks, Monroe found reasons to come to town more often than was strictly necessary. He came in for supplies and stopped at Gertrude's house to bring her a book from his collection that he thought she would enjoy, A History of the Cattle Drives North from Texas, written by a man who had been on 3 of them. She read it in 2 evenings and went to return it with her observations, and they ended up sitting on her small front porch in the November cold with blankets across their laps, and talking for 2 hours about the history of the land they were sitting on and what it had been before the cattle came, and what it might look like in another 50 years. He brought his second-string horse to town one afternoon to have it shod, and came by afterward with the horse still saddled to tell her he had spotted a family of pronghorn antelope on the north ridge of his property, and thought she might like to know, because she had mentioned once in passing that she found them beautiful, and he had apparently stored that away and kept it. She was touched by this in a way she had not expected to be touched by anything so small. But the truth about being invisible for a long time was that small acts of attentiveness carried enormous weight. He invited her for a ride on a Sunday afternoon in late November. A real ride, not a practical transportation to and from work, and she accepted. She had not ridden much since she was young. Her father had kept one old horse, sold after his death, but Monroe was patient with her unfamiliarity, and Calhoun was too well schooled to give her trouble, and they rode out into the open land north of the ranch while Pete Dawson and the other cowhands stayed tactfully busy in other parts of the property. The November land was stark and beautiful, the brush silver gray and the grass pale gold and the sky enormous and cold and utterly clear, and Monroe rode beside her and pointed out the geography of his land, what he planned to do with each piece of it, where the natural water sources were, where the ground was suitable for crops if he ever wanted to diversify. She asked good questions and he answered them fully, and at some point during the ride she realized that she was not just listening to the content of what he said, but was listening to the way he said it, the care and the vision in it, the clear and genuine love he had for this land that he had chosen as his own. It struck her that here was a man who had the same relationship with his land that she had with her work, not just something you did for survival, but something that was genuinely, inseparably part of who you were. You love it here, she said. You already love it even though you've only been here 2 months. He considered the flatlands ahead of them, the wide sky, the distant blue line of low hills. Yes, he said, I think I love it exactly as much as I knew I would. I don't think I'm the kind of person who makes a decision and then discovers it was wrong. She felt the oblique weight of that and looked at him sideways, but he was looking ahead at the land, and his face was simply open and calm. When they turned back toward the ranch and the low sun was throwing long orange shadows across the ground, he pulled up alongside her and said, very simply and without dramatics, Gertrude, I would like to court you properly if you'll allow it. Not just bring books and find reasons to stop by, though I intend to keep doing those things. I mean openly, with your consent and the town's full knowledge. She had been half expecting it and was still entirely unprepared for it. She held Calhoun's steady gait beside his while she thought, and he did not rush her. "The town will talk," she said finally. "The town talks regardless," he said. "I'd rather give them something worth talking about." "I am not," she started and then stopped, because she was about to say something that was simultaneously true and a kind of lie. She was not what people expected a rancher to want. That was what she had been going to say. She was not young or particularly beautiful or socially prominent or the kind of woman who filled a room. She was invisible. She was the woman people confused with someone else. But he was looking at her, and he was not confused, and he was not looking past her at something more interesting. He was looking at her specifically, with the full force of his steady, direct attention, and the thing she had been about to say died in the face of it. "Yes," she said instead. "I'll allow it." He smiled, that warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes, and she thought she might not ever get entirely accustomed to being the cause of that smile, and that this was perhaps as it should be. The courtship was gentle and earnest, and conducted with a simplicity that suited them both. He came to town twice a week, and sometimes they walked, and sometimes they sat in her front room reading in companionable silence, and sometimes they cooked dinner together in her small kitchen, which was an activity he took to with more competence than she had expected from a lifelong bachelor. He had, he explained, lived alone for 15 years, and a man either learned to cook adequately or he suffered, and he had preferred not to suffer. She made Christmas pudding for the first time in years, because she had not had reason to before, and he helped her stir it on the night before Christmas with her mother's old wooden spoon, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of spices, and she stood at the stove feeling something so full and warm and disorienting that she had to pause for a moment just to breathe through it. The town did, as she had predicted, talk. Agnes Whitmore was delighted beyond measure. She had apparently been maneuvering toward this outcome since approximately the night of her gathering, and felt proprietary satisfaction in the development. The other women of the town were more mixed in their reactions. Some were genuinely pleased for Gertrude, who was generally well liked in the abstract even if not well noticed in the specific. Some were simply surprised, because Monroe Ellsworth was the most eligible man in the county, and Gertrude Dugan was the woman who hemmed their dresses and whose name they sometimes had to stop and think about before saying. The surprise was its own small indignity, but Gertrude bore it with equanimity, because she had a lifetime's practice in bearing indignity quietly, and because the equanimity was genuine. She knew what she had, and she did not require anyone else's validation of it. Monroe, for his part, was entirely unconcerned with anyone's opinion of his choices. He was polite with the town, as he always was, but when he was with Gertrude, he gave her his full attention in a way that was visible and apparently unmistakable, and whatever the town might have said in its quieter corners, the sight of them together had a directness to it that discouraged most commentary. There was one afternoon in January when the situation was tested in a way that made Gertrude's composure work harder than usual. She was in Caldwell's, as she often was on Tuesdays, and a leaner Brant came in with her eldest daughter, a handsome young woman of 22 named Clara, who had been recently returned from a school in San Antonio, and who was exactly the type that the town had apparently envisioned for Monroe Ellsworth. Eleanor Brant was one of the women who had been most transparently surprised by Monroe's attention to Gertrude, and she was not a subtle woman, and the things she said to Clara while they stood near the fabric bolts were pitched just loud enough to be heard if one was paying attention. The gist of it was that Monroe Ellsworth was a practical man and would eventually see things clearly, and that a man with a ranch of that scale needed a young wife capable of running a proper household and providing him with a proper family, and that it was a shame about whatever temporary notion he had taken into his head, because certain women simply weren't built for that kind of life. Gertrude stood at the thread box with her back to Eleanor Brant and her composure entirely intact, and her hands quite steady, and she selected her thread and paid for it, and left the store without having given a leaner the satisfaction of a reaction. She was 31 years old, and she had been managing the small cruelties of people who did not see her for all of those years, and a leaner Brant's gossip was not the worst she had weathered. But she was quiet that evening when Monroe came by, and he noticed, because he always noticed, and he asked her directly what was wrong. She told him about it, honestly and without dramatizing it, because she had decided some time ago that honesty was the only way forward with this man, and that performing fine when she was not was something she refused to do. He listened. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. "Eleanor Brant," he said, "has opinions about things she knows nothing about." "She's not entirely wrong about some of it," Gertrude said. She was sitting across from him at her kitchen table with her coffee cup between her hands. "I am 31. I'm not young in the way Clara Brant is young." "I'm 38, he said. "You're 29 years younger than the person Eleanor Brant should actually be worried about, which is time itself, and time doesn't respond to gossip either." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Gertrude, I am not here out of a temporary notion. I am here because I have been paying attention and I know what I see, and I am not in the habit of being wrong about the things I pay attention to." A pause. "What is it you're actually asking me?" She looked at him. "I suppose I'm asking whether this is real." "Yes," he said, immediately and without qualification. "It is real." She let out a breath that was more complicated than she intended. "All right," she said. "All right," he echoed, and there was something in his voice that was both gentle and entirely serious. He asked her to marry him on a Thursday in the second week of February, in the morning, which was not the time or day that proposals were made in the romance novels she had occasionally read, but was entirely consistent with Monroe, who did things when the moment called for them rather than when convention suggested. He had come by early with the intention of walking with her to the general store, and they had gotten only as far as the gate at the end of her small yard when he stopped walking and turned to her in the cold morning air with the winter sun white and clean behind him, and said, "I want to marry you. I want to spend my life with you on that land and in that house, and I want to see you every day for the rest of my life. I know this is not a long courtship by the conventions of this town, but I also think that you and I both know what we are looking at, and I don't think waiting longer changes what I know." He paused. "Will you marry me?" She stood in the cold morning air in her good wool coat and looked at Monroe Ellsworth, who was looking back at her with his steady, direct attention and the quiet courage of a man who meant every word he had just said. And she thought about 31 years of being invisible, and she thought about what it felt like to be seen, and she thought about the warmth in her kitchen and the sound of his voice reading aloud from his history book while she sewed, and the way the ranch land looked in the afternoon light, and the gray roan horse and the smell of Christmas pudding and his hands steady and careful on a fence post, and the way he laughed. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Monroe, I will." He took her hands in both of his, there at the gate in the winter morning, and for a moment they just stood together in the cold, clear air, and she felt the solidity of him through his hands on hers, and she thought that this was what being seen felt like when it became permanent. Not a guest anymore but a tenant, and then not a tenant but a resident, and then not a resident but home itself. They were married in April, in the church with the bell that stuck in wet weather, on a day that was fortunately dry and clear and smelled of new grass, and the first of the spring wildflowers that had come up in the field beside the churchyard. Agnes Whitmore cried, which made several other women cry also, and Pete Dawson stood up for Monroe with a proud, cheerful formality that suggested he had been hoping for this exact development for some time. Gertrude had no family to stand with her, no parents, no siblings, but she had Mrs. Clara Hughes, the doctor's wife, who had been quietly kind to her for years and who was delighted to serve as her witness, and the church was full enough that the absence of blood family was softened considerably by the presence of community. She wore a dress she had made herself, because of course she had, because she was a seamstress and this was the garment that would matter most, and she had made it from a cream-colored silk that she had ordered special from the Abilene dry goods dealer, and that had arrived 2 weeks before the wedding wrapped in brown paper with the care it deserved. The dress was simple and beautifully fitted, and the most technically perfect thing she had ever sewn. And Monroe, when he saw her come through the church door on Mrs. Hughes's arm, went very still for a moment, and then smiled the kind of smile she had never seen on anyone's face before and hoped she would see on his face for the rest of her life. The minister read the words that had been read over millions of couples in the century before them, words that had made and sealed and blessed uncountable lives. And when Monroe repeated them back, his voice was steady and clear and meant in the specific, particular, fully considered way that he did everything. And when she repeated them, her voice was quiet and steady also, and the church was very still. He placed a plain gold band on her finger, warm from being in his pocket, and she felt it settle into place with a rightness that was almost physical. Moving into the ranch house was a process that took 2 weekends in early April, because Gertrude had more books than the size of her house had suggested, and Monroe's men were cheerfully roped into carrying boxes, and were rewarded with the kind of substantial midday meal that a woman who had been feeding only herself had not made in years. The house absorbed her things with a generosity that surprised her: her mother's small china teapot on the kitchen shelf, her father's old Bible beside Monroe's on the study shelf, her sewing things arranged in the sunny corner room that Monroe had cleared for her use, telling her that the light was better there, and he wanted her to have the best light. She stood in the doorway of that room on the first morning. She was truly a resident of the house rather than a visitor, with the spring sun coming in through the east-facing window and her sewing basket on the table he had carried in for her. And she understood that this was not simply a different house but a different life. And the old one was not gone. It was in her. It was part of her. It had made her who she was, but this was something new, something she had not known to hope for. Something that had come to her not in spite of her invisibility but somehow through it, because she had been paying close attention to the world for all those years, and she had been ready, when someone finally looked, to look back. Spring settled into the ranch with the kind of energy that was almost audible: new calves arriving in the south pasture, the water in the creek running high and fast with snowmelt from the distant hills, the cowhands out from dawn to dusk, repairing fences and clearing brush, and bringing in the remainder of the cattle that had been wintered in the sheltered draw to the east. Monroe worked the same hours his men worked, and Gertrude found that she respected this without reservation, and that the ranch days had their own rhythm that she settled into with surprising ease. Her sewing work continued. She had been concerned, in the planning phase of this change, that becoming the rancher's wife would alter her relationship to her trade, that people might expect her to give it up, or that she might feel she ought to, or that Monroe might have opinions about a wife who took in mending. But Monroe had said, when she raised the subject, that her work was hers, and that he had no more right to tell her to stop sewing than she had to tell him to stop ranching, and she had loved him for it immediately and specifically. She did ease back on the quantity of work she took in, partly because the ranch demanded her time in other ways, and partly because she was no longer sewing for pure financial survival. And this easing gave her the ability to be selective, to take on the work she found most interesting, and to give it more of herself than she had when she was stitching frantically to make ends meet. She made a christening gown for the Caldwell boy's wife that was so fine it was examined by every woman in Harlan Creek. She made Agnes Whitmore a winter coat with a particular embroidered collar that became one of the most admired garments in the county. The work was better when it was chosen rather than merely necessary, and the recognition of this was itself a kind of freedom. The summer was hot the way Texas summers are hot, which is to say categorically and without apology. The ranch hands moved more slowly in the afternoons, and the cattle sought the shade of the scattered oaks in the east pasture, and the creek dropped to a lazy, glittering thread between its banks. Gertrude and Monroe sat on the wide front porch in the evenings when the day's heat began to release, watching the sun go down over the flatlands in the spectacular colors that the Texas sky performed each night, as though for the specific benefit of anyone who happened to be watching. And they talked or were silent in equal comfort. And sometimes she read aloud to him, and sometimes he read aloud to her. And the evenings were long and warm and full in a way that made her understand, in the deepest part of herself, what a life could be when it was inhabited fully. In August, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, with the coffee on the stove and the sun coming in sideways through the east window, because she was Gertrude and she did not do dramatic things in dramatic places. She said, simply and directly, "Monroe, I'm going to have a baby." He was at the table with his coffee and he went very still, and then he looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The purest, most unguarded happiness she had ever seen on another person, wide open and specific and real. He came to her in 2 steps and held her face in his hands very gently, the way you held something infinitely valuable, and said, "Gertrude," just her name, but with so much in it that the name itself felt like a sentence, like a whole declaration. "Are you pleased?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "I am the most pleased I have ever been in my life," he said, with the unhesitating certainty that was entirely him, and she laughed from the warmth of it and leaned her forehead against his chest and felt his arms come around her, steady and solid and there. The pregnancy was not always easy. The summer heat was brutal on her body, and she was frequently tired in ways she had not expected, and there were days in September when she felt flat and gray and not at all like herself. Monroe was attentive without being smothering, checking on her without hovering, adjusting the work of the household with a practical competence that she appreciated enormously. He drove her into town for her appointments with Dr. Hughes, who was encouraging and straightforward in his assessment, and he took on more of the household management without comment or complaint. And when she felt well, he talked to her about the ranch's progress, and when she felt unwell, he simply sat with her and let her be unwell without requiring her to perform otherwise. She was frightened sometimes in the small hours of the night in the way that first-time mothers are frightened about whether everything would go correctly, about whether she knew enough, about the size and seriousness of what was coming. She told Monroe this, and he did not dismiss the fear or insist it was unfounded. He said, "I am a little frightened too. I think that's appropriate. It means we understand what it is." And this practical acknowledgement of the fear was more comforting than any reassurance would have been. The ranch continued to grow through the fall. Monroe hired 2 additional cowhands for the winter and took on a contract with a cattle buyer in Abilene that represented a significant increase in the operation's scale. He was building something here, carefully and methodically, with the same patient attention he brought to everything, and Gertrude watched it with a pride that felt entirely clean, because it was not her accomplishment but she understood it, and she was part of the world in which it was happening, and that was its own kind of gladness. There was an afternoon in October when a dispute arose between Monroe and a neighbor rancher named Calvin Reeves over the boundary line on the western edge of the property. A matter of some 150 yards of fencing that Reeves claimed was misplaced, and Monroe maintained was correctly cited according to the deed survey. The dispute had the potential to become ugly. Reeves was a hot-tempered man with a history of resolving land disputes through confrontation rather than law, and there was a period of about 2 weeks during which the situation was genuinely tense. Monroe handled it with his characteristic patience and precision. He obtained the original survey documents from the county courthouse, had them reviewed by a lawyer in Abilene, and presented Reeves with a clear and unambiguous legal resolution. Reeves was not pleased, but he was not foolish enough to fight a documented legal boundary, and the matter ended with a cold peace between the two properties that was preferable to what it might have been. Gertrude had watched the whole thing unfold and asked Monroe, one evening on the porch, whether it had been difficult, the patience of it, the containing of whatever frustration he had felt at Reeves's belligerence. It would have been difficult to lose the land, he said. The patience was easy compared to that. He looked out at the western edge of the property, just visible in the dusk. My father had a saying. He said that most of the things men fight about can be resolved by a piece of paper and a little time, and that the fighting itself costs more than the thing being fought over. I've found that to be true more often than not. And when it's not true, she asked. Then you stand your ground, he said simply. But you make sure first that it's actually your ground worth standing on. She loved him, she thought, in so many specific, particular ways, not in the general, abstract way of sentiment, but in the accumulated weight of specific moments and specific qualities observed over specific time. She loved the way he handled the Reeves dispute. She loved the way he talked to his horses. She loved the way he read, with his forehead resting on his hand and his attention complete. She loved the way he poured coffee, always exactly right, as though he had been paying attention since the first cup to how she liked it. She loved that he had made space in the study for her books without being asked, and had read 3 of them himself, and told her what he thought. She loved that he was kind to Pete Dawson, who was loyal and hardworking but not especially bright, with a consistent, unpretentious respect that was better than condescension and better than false equality. She loved that he had never once made her feel invisible. She had been invisible for so long that being seen still felt, sometimes, like a mild surprise, like turning a familiar corner and finding the view had changed to something beautiful. She thought she would probably feel it that way for a long time, maybe forever, and she had stopped minding that. It was a good kind of surprise, the kind worth keeping. The baby came on a January morning when the sky outside was a cold, clear blue, and the frost was white on the porch rails, and Monroe had been up since 4 in the morning sitting downstairs, because he had found that pacing the length of the front porch was the only thing he could do with himself that was not useless. Dr. Hughes was there, and Mrs. Hughes, and Agnes Whitmore, who had somehow made herself indispensable in the crisis of the moment, and who Gertrude was, on reflection, genuinely glad to have there. It was hard. Labor was hard, and Gertrude was not in the business of pretending otherwise or dressing it in softer language. It was many hours of something that tested the outer edge of what a person could endure while remaining essentially themselves, and she went through it with the same quiet, determined precision she brought to everything difficult, which meant without drama, but with her eyes entirely open and her will completely engaged. The child was born at 10:30 in the morning and was a boy, 9 pounds and healthy, with a startling amount of dark hair and his father's quality of looking at everything directly and without apparent anxiety about what he might find. Monroe was brought upstairs by Agnes with a speed that suggested Agnes had been ready to go get him the moment the baby drew breath. He came through the door and looked at Gertrude first. She noted this, that his first look was for her and not the child, and it meant something, and then at the baby in her arms, and his face did the same thing it had done when she had told him she was expecting, that wide-open, unguarded happiness, only bigger now, so big it was almost solemn. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son with the same care he brought to everything completely, attentively, with his full self. And the baby looked up at him with the unfocused intensity of newborns, and Monroe said very quietly, "Hello," the way one said hello to someone you had been waiting a long time to meet. They named him Thomas, for Monroe's father, whose middle name it had been, and James for Gertrude's father, whose given name it was. Thomas James Ellsworth. He had dark hair and gray eyes that might eventually be green, and a personality that declared itself within the first weeks as fundamentally serious and intensely curious about his surroundings, which Gertrude thought was approximately what you would get when you combined his 2 parents. Harlan Creek received the news of the birth with the particular warmth that small towns reserve for the arrival of children, and there was a steady stream of visitors to the ranch in the first weeks, each bringing food or practical gifts, or simply the offering of their company. Agnes Whitmore came 3 times in the first 2 weeks alone, and was so useful each time that Gertrude simply stopped being surprised about it. Eleanor Brandt came once, with a very fine baby blanket that she had clearly spent considerable effort making, and she said, with a sincerity that Gertrude chose to believe was genuine, that the baby was beautiful and that she wished them well, and Gertrude thanked her warmly, because she had no interest in carrying the small history of Eleanor's small unkindnesses forward into a life that was too full for it. Spring came again, Thomas's first spring, and the ranch came back to life around him, new calves and new grass and the creek running high, and the mockingbirds performing their elaborate, plagiarized concerts from every tree. Monroe would take Thomas out to the porch in the mornings when the weather was fine, and hold him facing outward, showing him the world of the ranch with a quiet, steady commentary that was partially for the baby and partially, Gertrude suspected, simply the expression of a man who found his life worth describing. She would watch them from the kitchen window sometimes, this man and this child against the wide Texas sky, and the warmth she felt was so complete and so specific that she had stopped trying to name it. It was simply hers. There were hard days, too, because life on a working ranch in 1883 did not suspend its difficulties for the sake of a new family. There was a late winter storm that killed 8 of the youngest calves before the temperature broke. There was a stretch of 3 weeks when one of the cowhands, a young man named Eli who had been with Monroe since Wyoming, was badly injured in a fence repair accident and needed tending and replacement. There was the ongoing work of the land itself, which was relentless and demanding and did not particularly care about anyone's personal circumstances. But Gertrude had grown up in difficulty, and she was not frightened by it. She had been managing alone for 3 years before Monroe, and before that she had been managing with a father who was kind but limited, and before that she had been managing the loss of her mother. And she had learned long ago that difficulty was not the opposite of joy, but simply its context, the frame in which the good things existed, and without which they would have less definition. She sewed a christening gown for Thomas that was the finest thing she had ever made, finer even than the one she made for other people's children, which had been very fine indeed. She used the remainder of the cream silk from her wedding dress, and it was not quite enough, so she added panels of white lawn that she attached with the most delicate cutwork she had ever attempted, and the finished garment was something that took her breath slightly when she held it up to the light. Monroe looked at it for a long time and then said, "You made our wedding dress from the same fabric," and she had not thought he had noticed that, had not known he would have registered or kept the detail, and the fact that he had stored it and held it and recognized it now in the christening gown was one of the more unexpectedly moving things that had ever happened to her. "I did," she said. "I'm glad," he said simply. Thomas was christened on a Sunday in April with the blooming land around the church and the bell ringing clear for once in the dry spring air, and Agnes Whitmore cried again, and Monroe held his son through the entire ceremony with the kind of calm, contained gladness that was his particular brand of happiness, and Gertrude stood beside him in the April light and felt, for perhaps the 1,000th time in the past year and a half, the specific, disorienting miracle of being fully known. The following year and a half were full in every sense of that word. Thomas grew from an infant into a walking, talking, opinionated small person with his father's steady attention and his mother's capacity for observation, and he was into everything on the ranch with a thoroughness that was simultaneously exhausting and magnificent. Monroe taught him to feed the horses with exaggerated seriousness when he was 2, and the horses tolerated this with a patience that Monroe said was evidence of their good character. Thomas called the gray roan cowhound by name before he could say several other words, which Monroe found disproportionately pleasing. Gertrude's work continued to evolve. She began, somewhat accidentally, to take on more complex garments, the kind of structured, technically demanding pieces that required real craft rather than just skill. Because word had spread in the county that the woman at the Ellsworth ranch was the finest seamstress for 100 miles in any direction, and the requests that came to her reflected that reputation. She hired a girl from town, a 15-year-old named Ruth who wanted to learn the trade, and taught her the basics with the same patience that Monroe had shown her in her early writing, and found that teaching was its own kind of pleasure. In the spring of 1885, Gertrude was expecting their second child. She told Monroe in the morning again because some patterns deserve repeating, and his reaction was the same quality of gladness it had been the first time: immediate, unguarded, specific. "Are you well?" He asked first before anything else, and she said yes, she felt well, and he held her for a long moment in the kitchen with the coffee on the stove and Thomas still asleep upstairs, and they stood in the quiet of the early morning and let the news settle into the house alongside everything else that was already there. This baby was easier, or perhaps Gertrude simply knew better what to expect. She was 34 now, and Dr. Hughes made the appropriate notes about age and rest, but she was strong and the pregnancy was uncomplicated, and she worked through most of it with only mild adjustments to her routine. Monroe, having been through this once, was slightly less fraught about it than the first time, though not by much, and Gertrude loved him for the fact that his concern was genuine rather than performed and therefore could not be argued away. The baby came in November, a girl this time, who arrived with considerably less drama than her brother had, and who looked at the world from her first moments with an expression of calm assessment that Gertrude recognized in a deep, bone-level way as something she had been looking at in the mirror for 34 years. They named her Catherine because Monroe had always liked the name, Mary for Gertrude's mother, the woman whose fever had left a girl of 11 to learn how to manage the world on her own. Monroe held Catherine with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and Thomas, who was 3 and very concerned about the new development, was introduced to his sister with a solemnity that made Monroe have to turn away briefly to compose himself. "She is small," Thomas observed. "She is," Monroe agreed. "She is not a horse," Thomas said. "No," Monroe confirmed. "She is not a horse, she is your sister, which is better." Thomas considered this. "Why?" "Because horses can't talk to you," Monroe said. "And she will be able to, eventually. And you will have someone who knows everything about where you come from because she comes from the same place." Thomas thought about this for a long time. Then he leaned forward very carefully and touched Catherine's hand with one small finger, and Catherine's hand closed around it with the automatic grip of the newborn, and Thomas looked at his father with enormous eyes and said, "She is holding me." "Yes," Monroe said. "She knows me," Thomas said. "She does," Monroe said. "She already does." Gertrude lay in the bed and watched Monroe explaining this to their son, and felt the warmth in her chest that was simply what her life was now, familiar and deep and real. And she thought about the woman she had been 3 years ago who had moved through this town invisibly, carrying other women's curtains and collecting her modest coins, and slipping back out of the door before anyone had fully registered her arrival. She was not that woman anymore. Or perhaps more accurately, she was still that woman in all the ways that mattered, all the quiet and the attentiveness and the capacity for invisible work well done. But she was also this woman in this house, with these children and this man, and the question of whether she was seen had been answered so completely and so consistently for 3 years that it had stopped being a question at all. It was simply fact. She was seen. She had always been worth seeing. It had only taken one person to look. In the years that followed, the years of Thomas learning to ride a real horse and Catherine learning to read in Monroe, expanding the ranch to 450 head, and building a second barn, and eventually hiring a foreman to help manage the scale of it. The core of their life together kept its particular quality. They disagreed sometimes, as two people with opinions and the respect to express them honestly will do, about practical matters, about Thomas's education, about the appropriate price for a contract Gertrude thought Monroe was undervaluing. They disagreed and talked it through and arrived at positions that were usually improved by the disagreement. This was, Monroe said once, what two people who were paying attention to each other looked like, and she agreed. She taught Ruth everything she knew about sewing, and Ruth eventually set up her own work, and the trade continued in Harlan Creek with a better practitioner in the form of a young woman who had been taught by the best. Gertrude continued to take on the work she loved best and leave the rest to younger hands, and she found that this was exactly the right balance for a life that was also full of children and land, and the particular, daily richness of a marriage between two people who genuinely saw each other. Agnes Whitmore remained a friend, the kind of friend that a woman like Gertrude, who had always been better at solitude than company, was improved by having. They drank coffee on the porch and discussed town business and Agnes's inexhaustible social projects and Gertrude's work and Agnes's concerns about her husband's health, which were the ordinary concerns of a woman married for many years to a man she loved. And in this, as in everything, Agnes was more substantial than her social energy suggested. Pete Dawson married a woman from the neighboring county and brought her to live on the ranch in the foreman's house that Monroe built, and she and Gertrude became good neighbors in the practical, cheerful way of women who share proximity and mutual respect. Their children grew up alongside Thomas and Catherine, and the Ellsworth Ranch on a summer afternoon had the sound and energy of children everywhere, and the smell of cooking and the constant purposeful noise of a working cattle operation. In the spring of 1889, a full 7 years after Monroe Ellsworth had ridden down Main Street in Harlan Creek on his gray roan horse, and Gertrude Dugan had stood on Agnes Whitmore's porch and not been noticed, Monroe found her one Sunday morning sitting in her sewing room with the east light on her work, and Thomas's voice audible from the yard below, and Catherine singing something indistinct to herself in the room down the hall. And he stood in the doorway for a moment watching her before she looked up. When she looked up, he was looking at her with the same expression he had worn in Caldwell's General Store 7 years ago, when she had told him about the canvas thread, and he had looked at her with genuine interest and not looked away. "What?" she said, because he had been standing there long enough for her to notice. "Nothing," he said, "just you." She held his gaze, this woman who had been invisible for her entire life, this woman who had learned to disappear so thoroughly that she had nearly forgotten she was there at all, and she felt the warmth of his looking as something solid and real and permanent, and she thought that there was no more invisible woman standing in Harlan Creek or anywhere else, because she had been found too completely and too specifically and too well to ever be lost again. "Come and sit with me," she said. He came and sat in the chair beside her window, and the April light came in over the flatlands and through the glass and lay across them both, and the ranch was alive and full around them, and the man who had finally looked was still looking, and she who had always been worth seeing was finally, completely, entirely seen. Thomas came in from the yard shortly after, trailing mud and explaining something at considerable length about the behavior of one of the yearling calves, and Catherine followed him with her book held against her chest and her quiet, observant eyes moving between her parents, with the assessment of a child who understood that the room she had just walked into was a good room. Monroe listened to Thomas with full attention, and Gertrude met Catherine's eyes, and they shared the small, mutual understanding of two people who see the same things and love the same people, and are exactly where they are meant to be. Outside, Calhoun moved slowly in the spring pasture, old now but still good, and the new calves were in the south field, and the creek was running with the season's snowmelt, and the sky over the flatlands was the enormous Texas blue that Gertrude had been looking at for 38 years and had never stopped finding beautiful, and the whole of it, The land and the house and the children and the man and the work and the ordinary, irreplaceable dailiness of a life lived in full light, visible and known, was hers.